So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. Thank you all for joining us in the first inaugural event by the Sustainability Professionals of Saudi Arabia. We are honored and pleased to have with us as a keynote speaker and a guest, Richard Collins, founder of the CSR Accreditation Association. The bottom line of the association is enabling environmental and social responsibility to build ethical and caring organizations. Richard basically aims to help improve the world for future generations by reducing the negative impact we have on the environment and by building a better and cohesive society. As an experienced brand strategist, Richard has pursued a passion of helping companies in the public and private and third sector to promote their CSR and sustainability efforts. Richard founded and launched the CSRA in 2018, which provides a global environmental and social responsibility accreditation scheme. Since then, CSRA has developed global sustainability training courses and workshops, social impact reporting, and CSR program for primary and secondary schools. CSR accreditation now operates on an international stage with partners and offices being established throughout the globe. Richard is an international keynote speaker on sustainability, and to complement this, he is also co-runs the International CSR Excellence Award. Thank you very much for joining us today, Richard, and giving us some valuable time and inputs.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed, and thank you for that lovely introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I really do hope that I can help bring some extra information and enlightenment around our collective sustainability journeys.
I'm looking forward to it. We have quite a list of questions here set for you, and we with a short time frame. So let's kickstart the questions here. With the CSR organization, what do you see are the key elements and principles of global standards for social responsibility, and how can they be applied in the Saudi market? So, from an international perspective, narrowing down to the Saudi market.
So, as you know, that there are a whole myriad of international standards around sustainability, and those standards will focus very much on specific elements of the sustainability agenda. A lot of that is really focused on the environmental side. So when you think about the ESG agenda, a lot of the focus is on the E and not so much on the S and the G. We do have the introduction of the International Sustainability Standards from the ISSB, and we already have in place things like the General Reporting Directive, which has been around for a very long time and has advisors in many countries. We also have the TCFD, which is a mandatory requirement to record your non-financial disclosure reporting with regards to climate change. And coming in to Europe and possibly being introduced to the rest of the world next year, we have the CSRD, so that's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So there's a lot of things going on, as you can appreciate, and it's a very complicated sustainability landscape. What we've tried to do is establish a framework that helps start a process. And that framework is based on 4 pillars of environment, workplace, community, and philanthropy. And the idea being, if we think about the word CSR, or, as it was called, corporate social responsibility, we also wanted to create an inclusive C. So in other words, we're not just talking about the corporate side of things. We're extending that out to include communities, to include charities, to include climate, to include collaboration, a collectiveness, so that collaborative social responsibility allows for all stakeholders to contribute to building a really valuable and impact-driven sustainability journey. So when we start to look at those global standards for social responsibility, we like to define those against those 4 pillars. And I think for your audience, it's very easy to see that when you look at what we are already doing within those 4 pillars, and what are we already doing within the environmental pillar when it comes to recycling, for example, for waste management, when it comes to energy use, when it comes to travel, what are we doing? And I think we can probably say we're doing a lot of things that we're not really aware of, because we're not really pulling them together. And when we start to look at the workplace pillar, what are we already doing there? How are we addressing mental health and well-being? How are we looking at diversity and inclusion? How do we respond to apprenticeships and work placements? Looking at governance. And when we look at the community and charitable pillars, how are we engaging with our local communities in a meaningful way, addressing local issues, local economic development, and local recruitment? And how do we support the third sector in terms of our responsibility to helping charities deliver on their goals? So I hope you can see that just starting off with a basic framework, you can then use that, and then you can use those 4 pillars to address, for example, the Sustainability Development Goals, the 17 SDGs, or, for example, the 3 areas of ESG. So you can use that as a building block to then look at where your sustainability journey is going to be taking your organization.
Wonderful. I think there's lots to unfold in that that you mentioned. So let's start with, you mentioned the ISSP, for example, and other organizations. So can you provide some examples of international organizations or frameworks that you have developed as standards for social responsibility? And what can be learned from their, the experiences and the exposure?
So, yeah, I mean, we have worked over the years. We started off as a UK-focused or based organization pre-pandemic. And then the pandemic allowed us to take advantage of the fact that our training went online through Zoom and virtual calls. And that allowed us to address a global market. And by doing so, we were able to recognize that different organizations around the world were at different stages of their journey. And as we started to use our framework to introduce through our training to those organizations benefited from many different kind of aspects. So, for example, within the region, we partnered with the various organizations within the Middle East. And we have accredited organizations in Qatar and Bahrain and indeed Saudi Arabia as well. And in the case of, for example, the Abu Dhabi Ports Authority, we did some work with them. It was to help them aggregate what they were already doing. And I think the problem that larger organizations have is that they have multiple departments with a lot of different people, tasked with a lot of different roles. And then this huge introduction of a sustainability manager or an ESG manager or a social value manager. And then within organizations that have multiple departments like HR, finance, facilities. And we were finding that a lot of work was broken down, was scattered throughout those organizations. And I think one of the great benefits is that the process of becoming an accredited organization. So just to sort of make an identification around the accreditation process, the accreditation is a process that allows you to pull the information together based on those 4 pillars. It's not really just about becoming accredited. It's actually beginning a process that starts you on a journey. And in many cases, the process of putting an application together was helping those organizations recognize just how much they were doing. And more importantly, how those organizations would evidence and support what they were doing so that this was not going to be about greenwashing or box ticking. We've got to move away from a mandatory requirement to do things because we feel we have to doing things because we need to do them and we need to support and evidence them. And I think the other benefit that organizations got from working with us, whether they're micro businesses, incidentally, or multinationals, was the ability to impact report what they were doing. So this process allows a starting position for benchmarking, for auditing, and then using that information to address other requirements like the ISSB or the CCFD or the CSRD or the other many acronyms that we come across that describe how we should be reporting our impacts to a wider audience of stakeholders.
Excellent. So from that point, do you see any obstacles or any difficulties that you see can hinder the advancement of that in the region in Saudi Arabia or globally?
Yeah, I think not just in Saudi, and I think our experience is that we've worked with organizations, in Indonesia and South Africa and India and the US and Canada and Europe. And actually, there's a great similarity between the obstacles and problems that get in the way. So I don't think it's a region-specific issue in terms of some of these problems, but it's largely to do with having the time and capacity in the first place. So, for example, we hear a very loud top-down approach. especially as we start to see more mandatory requirements coming into place about how we report our ESG credentials and so on and so forth. And the difficulty, well, who's going to do it? It's all very well saying, well, we need an environmental policy, or we need a policy in social value, or we need to do something about the governance or the social side of our businesses and organizations. But who's going to do the work? And what support have those individuals got? So I think one of the biggest problems is capacity building within an organization. We need to identify those internal stakeholders who will become the sustainability ambassadors for our business. So number one big problem is how do we build capacity? The second big problem is a premise that this is going to cost a lot of money, that we don't have time. You know, we have a global cost of living crisis, especially around resource and finances. And frankly, we're too busy recovering from the pandemic and we don't have time to do these things. The thing is, you're already doing them. That's the whole point. You know, at some level, you're already delivering against those 4 pillars. So it's about aggregating what you're doing and making the most of it. This is not a cost, it's an investment. And yes, there may need to be a bit of investment up front, but the long-term benefits will be rewarding, both in terms of financial value and also, you know, social capital and environmental capital as well.
Yeah, I think definitely there's commonality between the difficulties there. And we mentioned this, especially in the capacity building and the knowledge transfer and the know-how between different segments in the company and all of the sessions that we had today. So I think that's one of the key pillars, basically, from a personal perspective, that drives me to initiate the SPSA organization, is basically to give the advantage of people to find information, to connect, to be advancing in their industries and in their specialities in that area. From your point of view, because you mentioned that you are, you know, focusing with the CSR accreditation on different aspects, government, private sector, and third sector. How do you see the private sector, for example, thrive in that area, and what is your advice to them?
Well, I think, you know, we take a view, first of all, that environmental and social responsibility should be for everybody. So we feel that it should be as much a bottom-up approach as a top-down approach. For the private sector, it's got to have C-suite endorsement. It's got to have that senior management endorsing and supporting an environmental and social responsibility commitment that organization has. And the private sector then has to build in the capacity to allow the individuals, the internal stakeholders within their organization, to deliver. And I don't mean on a voluntary level. I think there's a lot of organizations who will put a sustainability panel together within their organization and expect those individuals to work, you know, almost outside of their work hours. This has to be paid for if it's going to deliver the impacts that we want them to deliver. So I think within the private sector, another area that's really important is the whole conversation around materiality. So what is the sustainable materiality for our organization? And the only way to really determine that is proper external and internal stakeholder engagement. So what I think happens is that sustainability allows very, very much for the first time an opportunity to engage not just with your customers, but your competitors, your supply chain, your internal audience, asking them what do they need, what would they like to see happen within your organization. And by doing that, by using a materiality survey and actually reaching out to those organizations to find out what's important to them. Is it net zero? Is it going to be stuff around TCFD? Is it going to be around, you know, the future shape of sustainability practices? You know, we can learn from our customers. We can learn from our competitors. We can learn from our staff. You know, and that engagement, stakeholder engagement, you know, is a great way to create inclusivity amongst all the audiences you're speaking to. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity for the private sector to get out of its silos and actually engage with the wider world and bring together the information. Because as I said, this is about collaborative social responsibility. We can't do it on our own in the dark. We have to do it with the support of everybody around us.
Exactly. And you mentioned something about the voluntary. It's no longer an issue. It's no longer kind of an option that companies and private sector can take, is that I'm voluntarily disclosing my information from a CSR perspective or so on. What do you think that from a government perspective, the policies, the frameworks, how can they enforce that? How can they facilitate or make the applications easier for these companies or even the third-party sector as well?
Well, I guess from a governmentary point of view, that there can be incentives, but I don't think you can kind of, mandate everything, because it becomes then something that we have to do rather than something we should do. Because at the end of the day, sustainability should be something that we're doing because it's the right thing to do. If we're going to leave this planet in a better place for future generations, then I think we all recognise we have to do it. In fact, I think the drivers don't necessarily come from the government. Of course, with regards to our scope 1, 2 and 3 reporting and the net zero agenda, there's going to be more governmental regulatory pressures for organisations to do things. But I think the drivers are many. And one of the biggest drivers we've found in the UK, especially amongst business sectors like the legal and financial sectors, is about building a purpose-driven culture that people want to be part of. And this addresses retention and it addresses recruitment. So we can recognise that there's a globally new generation of talent that are being very selective about the companies they want to work for. So therefore, you need to address their sense of value and purpose as human beings if you're going to bring them into your business and keep them there as the sustainability ambassadors to drive your agenda forward. So I think there was a mixture then of governmentary regulatory pressure that you won't just get from our own government. You'll find that they may come from governments in other parts of the world because they will be pressing for information there. But you're also going to get drivers because of that staff retention, recruitment, and staff engagement. And also one of the other areas, funnily enough, that we've come across a lot in the last 8 months has been children pressure. In other words, those of us who have kids, it's mum and dad, what are you doing about my future? We've had a significant UK organisation whose 18-year-old son said to the chief exec, "Dad, are you the guy killing the dolphins?" And that absolutely shattered him. So the thing is, I think there's a desire to do something that actually reduces the negative impact we have on the planet in terms of climate change, but also to improve the kind of work conditions that we work in to create a better world for those future generations as well.
That's amazing to see that movement, especially from the young generation as well. And that's something that I think that will be a focus for COP28 that's coming on, in the doorstep in the next end of the month. How do you see this, agenda that we want to take forward from an international perspective, and how do you see it in the region? Because Middle East is hosting this event, and this is the third time COP28 COP is basically hosted in the Middle East. How do you see that in the platform or in the stage of COP28?
Well, I think there are pros and cons with the COPs. The COPs have been going on for a long time, and how much influence have they really had on what we're doing to the world? It's like the IPC and so on and so forth. That we aren't listening, and therefore, and I think we're beginning to wake up. Since the Paris Accord, we started to introduce businesses into the process and engage them in a way that's making a difference. But one of the big problems, and this is a problem, as you may know, I'm a senior advisor to the All Parties Parliamentary Group for ESG in the UK. And one of the big problems we have there is global equivalence around the ratings, around the standards. So the International Sustainability Standards Board are for the first time putting together information from the TCFD and other areas to create a global standard. And I think there's work to bring ESG within that field as well, because at the moment there's no like-for-like measurement. And it's our ambition at CSRA that our basic framework of the 4 pillars is the building blocks between to apply a regional and global standard for environmental and social responsibility that can help people then move on and address areas that are relevant to themselves. But I have to say, this is state of play. We mustn't beat ourselves up for not doing enough. We're doing amazingly well. And our trouble is, in a world of predominantly negative narrative, we forget that environmental and social responsibility is brilliant for good storytelling, providing you can deliver the good story doing to back up what you're saying, because we're beginning to see regulation come in around making claims that can't be substantiated and fines that companies will have to pay for doing that. So I think we are on a journey. We are making progress. We are moving forward. And I think in the next 20, 30 years, we will reach a point in which we will have, global agreement over those sustainability standards and with regards to the rating agencies and so on and so forth.
Exactly. That kind of triggered something in my mind when we talked about the standards and from an international perspective. Saudi has put the vision to be carbon neutral by 2060. For standards like CSRA and other organizations, ISP and so on, how do you see Saudi can utilize those initiatives or those organizations to help them achieve those goals, maybe even before reaching 2060?
Well, again, I mean, obviously, net zero is a 2050 goal, and I think it's working with other countries to support your country on its journey. Again, we don't live in our silos. There are lots of things we can learn. The great thing about the COPs, and just to go back to the COP, because I was a bit scathing about the fact that we don't listen to it, but actually the fact that they bring people together in the first place. You can listen to loads of international speakers. You can look at what other countries are doing. You can adapt. You may even pass on information to countries that aren't doing as much as they should be. So it's about how we learn from each other and how we set an examples for others as well. So I think there's a lot that Saudi can do in terms of looking at what the rest of the world's doing, looking at what it's doing well, dropping things that aren't working so well. Most importantly, because, with regards to the net zero agenda, it's widely accepted that we're not going to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere. That's just part of what we're going to always be doing at some level. But what can we do to offset that? How can we reduce other areas so that we create that net zero level? And if we can help, when I say we, the rest of the world can help Saudi actually achieve its goals sooner than 2060, then that would be a really great result. But the important thing is to have a goal in the first place and not just to meander towards something that might just constantly get kicked into the long grass.
Exactly. And no, I think there's some optimism there because of the applications now we have for sustainability in the Saudi Vision 2030. And some of the targets are actually being achieved way ahead of their targets. And that's something that I'm ambitious and optimism about it, is that we might be ahead of the curve and really achieve those goals before 2060. So one of the aspects I want to conclude, our discussion is about, transferring the knowledge and the know-how and the gap that we saw in the market in terms of the capacity building. How can CSRA with collaborations like with us and the SPSA and so on, narrow that gap? And what do you suggest and recommend to people listening to us to do?
Well, there's loads of things that we can do. And in terms of what CSRA offers, we have 4 key operating areas. We have a consultation area, we have the accreditation area, obviously, we have a social impact reporting area, and we also have the educational area. And one of the things that we found with the educational, which is, we have with Dr. Hannah Albana, we incorporated CSRA Arabia over 12 months ago, 18 months ago almost. And that provided an Arab-speaking portal to have a look at what CSRA does, and that includes all our training in Arabic as well as in English. And the training is a very easy, straightforward course, 6 modules that allows individuals, especially employees within organizations, to understand what that sustainability landscape looks like, address the regulation, understand how you build a strategy, and most importantly, how you communicate the outputs to others. So I think, a great way to bring that gap down is to get as many people thinking and talking about sustainability as possible, and then using that to drive a national agenda forward.
Well said. I think definitely we have our task cut off ours from us as SPSA perspective, and bringing CSRA, for example, to the arena and advancing that knowledge and narrowing that gap as well. Any final words that you'd like to convey to our listeners and to our audience from, either following us from Saudi Arabia or from the international perspective?
Well, I think, the final words I have to say really is do something. Don't wait. A lot of organizations say, we're not ready to do stuff. We're still making things, get on and do it, report it, communicate, engage with each other, and start showing the positive impacts that we're making collaboratively. And again, do collaborate, because that's the only way we're going to address these issues. We can't do them on our own. So I think, the best advice I can really offer is get started, and use a framework to help you, benchmark and audit what you're doing. Because if you're not if you haven't got that benchmark in place, you won't be able to measure the progress you're making going forward. So again, look at the KPIs you can put in, look at the way you can measure results, look at the way you can use third-party organizations to support you around, for example, your carbon footprint or your, working governance conditions and practices, and how you can put in surveys and methodologies to show that you are making that progress, and then report it, share the information with as many stakeholders as you possibly can.
Exactly. And I think you echo what Mahesh has said in one of the keynote speeches that we had today, is sharing that information and not holding it and see it's our precious information that we don't disclose. It's knowledge that needs to be shared, as you rightly said.
Yes, absolutely. And it's not about bragging and showing off. It's about showing leadership, and it's about that collaborative nature of social responsibility. So yes, don't hold on to it, share it, and use it to build a better and brighter future for us all.
Exactly. Well, we come to the end of the time allotted for this session. I think, given the time frame, we would love to have you discuss this further, and we can go on this discussion, this important issue. But thank you very much for giving us your time, Richard. Definitely we'll be in touch in future collaborations with SPSA and CSRA, and we'll definitely connect you with the industry here, with our audiences and our professionals that follow the SPSA achievements. And this is, as I said, this is just the beginning. Looking forward to more collaborations.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure spending time with you this afternoon, morning, evening, whenever. And I hope it has been of use and insightful.
It has been. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.